Most stories about dam removal end at the fish, but the Elwha River did something almost nobody expected. And it had nothing to do with salmon. It rebuilt 40 acres of land, it grew a coastline out of nothing, and it did it in a matter of years. To understand how, you have to think about what a river actually carries. We picture rivers as moving water, but a healthy river is also a conveyor belt of solid earth, hauling sand, gravel, and stone down from the mountains and delivering it to the sea, drip by drip, for thousands of years. That constant supply of sediment is what builds and maintains beaches, riverbanks, and the entire coastline at a river's mouth. Cut off the supply, and the coast begins to starve. For a century, that's exactly what the Elwha's two dams did. They didn't only block fish, they caught sediment. Every year, the sand and gravel the river carried down from the Olympic Mountains piled up behind the concrete, behind Elwha Dam and Glines Canyon Dam, instead of reaching the ocean until the reservoirs, Lake Aldwell and Lake Mills, held a staggering load of trapped earth, more than 20 million tons of it. Meanwhile, starved of new material, the coast at the river's mouth slowly eroded away. Elders of the lower Elwha Clalam tribe remembered wide beaches from their youth. By the time removal began, those beaches had worn down to a hard, bare field of cobblestones, a gray, lifeless place that looked, as one description put it, almost lunar. Then, between 2011 and 2014, the dams came out. After Congress had authorized the restoration back in 1992, it fell to the National Park Service, working alongside the United States Geological Survey and other agencies, to actually make it happen. Olympic National Park, which surrounds much of the upper Elwha watershed, would be the primary beneficiary. And when the removals were complete, all that trapped earth was set loose at once. What followed was the largest deliberate release of sediment in the history of American river restoration. A century of stored sand and gravel began moving downstream in an enormous pulse. At first, that pulse was pure chaos. So much sediment poured into the river that the water turned thick and brown, and out at the river's mouth, where the Elwha meets the Strait of Juan de Fuca, divers who slipped beneath the surface found themselves in darkness. In water only a few feet deep, in the middle of the day, it could be as dark as night, the sunlight simply swallowed by the churning cloud of mud. The river had to get worse before it could get better, but that violent brown flood was carrying something priceless downstream, a century of stolen earth on its way home. And when it reached the sea, the transformation was almost immediate. The sediment settled at the river's mouth and started building. Where there had been eroding cobble and open water, new land appeared. Nearly 40 acres of it, a figure documented by United States Geological Survey researchers tracking the growing delta, rising up out of the sea. The bare gray lunar beach was buried under soft, fine sand. A shoreline that had been dying for 100 years was suddenly, visibly growing. And life moved onto the new land almost before it had finished forming. The soft sand was exactly the habitat that shellfish had been missing. Dungeness crab, geoducks, cockles, and clams colonized the new benthic substrate, the seafloor, that simply couldn't have held them before when it was all bare rock. Within a few years, crab had returned in numbers high enough to support a small fishery again. Forage fish, the small, silvery fish that everything larger eats, came to spawn in the fresh sand. Among them was the eulachon, an oily little smelt that had been largely absent for years, suddenly showing up in abundance and feeding the whole food web around it. But it wasn't a clean victory for everyone, and this is the part that makes the story honest. Just offshore, there were kelp forests, tall underwater groves that had grown on the old rocky bottom, sheltering a whole community of sea creatures. When the sediment plume rolled over them, it was a disaster. The mud blocked the sunlight the kelp needed to grow and buried the rocks it anchored to. Large stretches of kelp died. For a while, it looked like the coast was trading one rich habitat for another, losing its underwater forests even as it gained its beaches. But then, as the great sediment pulse passed and the water gradually cleared, the kelp began to come back, recolonizing and climbing back toward its old abundance. The lesson was patience. In a disturbance this big, some winners arrive first and some losers recover later, and you cannot judge the outcome by the wreckage of the first year alone. The most extraordinary response of all wasn't an animal moving in, or even recovering. It was an animal transforming to stay. The buffalo sculpin, Inifris bison, is a lumpy, bottom-dwelling fish that survives by camouflage, matching itself to whatever it's sitting on. Before the dams came down, the seafloor at the river's mouth was reddish rock draped in algae, and the local sculpin wore matching tones of brown and red. Then the sediment arrived, burying the old world and turning the bottom to pale sand and broken white shell. And scientists watched the sculpin change color to match, shifting toward light gray and white so they could keep disappearing against the transformed ground. The animal literally repainted itself to survive the new world the river had built. The rebuilding wasn't only at the coast. Go back upstream to where the two reservoirs had drowned the valley for a century, and an entirely different resurrection was underway. When the lakes drained, they left behind acres of raw, exposed lakebed, bare and lifeless. Crews planted hundreds of thousands of native seedlings to hold the soil, and then the wild came to reclaim it. Camera surveys in the former reservoir beds began documenting the return of a whole community, deer and elk grazing where boats once floated. Black bears, cougars, bobcats, and beavers moving into the reborn floodplain to begin their own patient work of engineering wetlands. Dead trees, flushed out of the old reservoirs, stacked into log jams downstream, and built the exact pools and hiding places that young salmon need. That's the part the fish-focused version of this story always misses. When you take down a dam, you're not just reopening a river for fish to swim through. You're releasing a century of imprisoned Earth, and that Earth goes back to work doing what it was always meant to do: building beaches, raising new land out of the sea, handing a blank, fertile canvas to crabs and clams and beavers and trees. The river even reached back and remade the coastline it had been starving for 100 years, in only a few. The Elwha didn't simply come back to life. It rebuilt the very ground that life needs to stand on, and in doing so, it proved something we forget every time we look at a river and see only water. A river isn't just a thing that flows through a landscape. A river is the thing that builds one, and the Elwha is only the beginning. Right now, 600 miles to the south, the largest dam removal in history is unfolding on the Klamath River. 4 dams gone, more than 400 miles of habitat reopened. Everything you just saw the Elwha do: the sediment, the new land, the animals rushing back in. The Klamath is starting to do now, on a scale several times larger. The Elwha showed us the blueprint. It taught us that a freed river doesn't just heal, it builds. It rewrites its own coastline, resurrects its own valley, and hands the raw materials of life back to everything that was waiting. So the next time you stand at the edge of a river and see nothing but moving water, remember what the Elwha proved. You're not looking at a thread running through the land. You're looking at the thing that made the land in the first place. And when we set it free, it remembers exactly how.